Okay, in this video we're going to discuss JavaScript arrays. So let's get in our text editor and create a file called array.js. And we're going to be running this JavaScript program using Node.js from the terminal. Console.log. This is just a nice indication to start off the program to let us know everything's working properly. Node and then array.js. Okay, and console.log displays things to the console, so we see running application there. So that's good. So let's take a look at arrays. We've discussed variables and data types, and arrays are basically just a way to store more than one value in a single variable name. Arrays are what's known as a collection of data, right? So arrays are referenced by index. To create an array literal, you use a left and right square bracket. Okay, so this is an empty array. If I run node by itself over here and just create an empty array and press enter, the result is an empty array. I can also have an array literal. It's an empty array literal. I literally type that into my code, right? I can type the length property afterwards, dot length. 0. So there are 0 elements of this array. I could also, alternatively, store the array in a variable and say a.length. But it's important to note there is no difference between a.length realistically and the array literal.length. Whenever you have an array literal, you can just apply the dot operator right afterwards, just as though it were a variable name. Okay. So if I have an array like this, let arr equal an empty array. One of the first things I might want to do is to add items to it. You can add any type of data you wish to an array. Like this, console.log, we can log out the array, or we can access individual items of the array. Let's also log out the length here. So array.length, and then we'll print out the array. Here underneath, we're going to access individual items of the array starting at index 0. So this first item is index 0, and then this is index 1, and this item is index 2. Okay, so as I access these items, I using reference by index, I use the identifier name, that is the variable that is storing the array, and then square brackets, and inside the square brackets go the index of the item that I'm trying to access. So array 0, array 1, and array 2. So these are the items, the individual items in my array. So I can run this program using node, and I can run the name of the file is array.js. Okay, so we see the array length is 3, then we printed out the array on this line. So array length, and we printed out the array. Then we logged out each of the individual items of the array, and we access those using the square bracket notation referenced by index. Okay. Now, because these are numeric references, I could also use a variable name. Let I is a common variable name used to mean index. I can say let I equal 0, and then put I in here. And then here I can say I plus equals 1, which means add 1 to I. And then put I in here. Or I++ is another way of saying add 1 to I. So in each one of these, the index here is a variable. I starts out at 0. Then we add 1 to I, so this will be 1. We'll access the item at index 1. And then we add 1 to I again, and at this point I is 2, and so we'll access the third item in our list. 0 true string. Right? So that works fine. What happens if we increment I again and try to log out I? This time I will be at index 3, which as we can see is beyond the bounds of our array. So let's try to run the program and see what happens. Undefined. So while some programming languages may give you an error, JavaScript simply returns undefined because there's nothing stored at that value or at that index in this particular list of data. Okay, so that's a similar behavior as if you had an object. Let obj equal an object, and this is an object literal because I am literally writing it into my code. To make an object literal, an empty object literal, you create two left and right, or a pair of left and right curly brackets. If I want to add a key value pair, I can type that in, A and apple. I'm sorry, that should have a colon, A colon apple, and the comma comes at the end. So A is the key, and then the value is apple. All right, so in this, I can say console.log obj.a should return the value at key A, which should be apple. So this should log out apple. Right? But what happens if I reference a key that isn't in our dictionary or in our object in JavaScript terms? And these are very similar to Python 3 dictionaries. Well, if I access an element that's not there, in Python you might encounter an error, but in JavaScript it simply says undefined because there's no value stored at that key name. So you don't receive an error. So this can be nice, but it can also be troubling, because if you accidentally try to access something that doesn't exist, you don't receive an error. So sometimes that can be a good thing, or sometimes that can be a bad thing. It can be a bad thing if you didn't intend to access something that doesn't exist, and then you would expect to get some sort of error, but instead your program happily goes along, and then later down the road you find out that there's no variable where you thought there was, and it can cause problems further down in the program than you might have otherwise thought. So the point of that is to demonstrate how objects and arrays both handle access to items that aren't there. Okay, so with arrays we access by index. So what goes inside of the square brackets is the integer value. And also it's important to note that this could be a string value. If we do console.log array item 2 as a string, oops, let's spell console right, this still works. We should still get another instance of string there. Okay, so we got yeah, after our, right, this one was undefined, we need to move that up there. So we get string and string. So two instances of string. Okay, so that's because under the hood an array is just an object as well. Okay, so if we do type of array, go ahead and do this down here, console.log type of my array. Instead of saying array, it says object. That's because it is an object. All arrays are object, and you can access them, everything in them, the same way as an object. One difference is it has additional functionality associated with this object. One of those items is the length, the .length property, which tells you how many items are in it. And we generally, when you add items to an array, it gives it an index number instead of a key. But realistically, that index number is a key, which is why it works as a string as well. So there's really no difference between accessing an item with the string value 2 or the numeric value 2. because under the hood it's just an object and you can access it either way. Part of the reason this happens is because of something called coercion in JavaScript. So in many programming languages, if you have an expression with addition, I can add numeric values, fine, and I can add string values, fine. But what happens when I add a numeric value to a string value, or a string value to a numeric value? Okay, most languages, including Python, if you are adding things of two different types, they will fail. You will get an error saying unable to add type string to type integer, or something to that effect. So we run the program, but here we see JavaScript does something smart, right? The numeric value, that evaluates to 14, which makes sense. The string evaluation evaluates to 59, that character, right? We didn't add these numbers together mathematically. We added two characters together, which is basically concatenation. And on these two lines, JavaScript did something rather intelligent. It said to itself, okay, we have two operands. One is a string and one is a number. What makes the most sense? Can I convert one of these to something else to where it will make sense? So JavaScript could theoretically convert this 5 to a number, but not all strings are able to be converted to a number. However, all numbers are able to be converted to string values. So it chose the option that will work for every single type of integer data. So anytime you have a string plus an integer or a number, it's going to add them together as strings. So this example here will demonstrate that, like a 5 as a string plus a 9 as a number, we could convert this string to a number, right? And then add them together. However, if I have a different string, a for example, and 5, I can't convert a to a decimal number and add them up. But I can always, no matter what the case is, I can always convert the number to a string. So that is the default behavior. So JavaScript, if it encounters a type in an expression that doesn't match the operator, it coerces the value. This is called data coercion, right? And it can be a really good thing, or it can be a frustrating thing if you're not aware of it. All right, so it always converts by default. Lots of things it'll convert to string so that you can go ahead and join them together with a plus sign. All right, so that's some of what's happening here. When we access an element in an array by a numeric value, it gets converted to a string value, or by a string value, it gets converted to the numeric value, whichever way you want to look at it. All right, but ultimately, it's not much different than an object. It is a JavaScript object under the hood. All right. So if we run this again, we see 5 and 9 were joined together as though they were string values. So JavaScript coerced the value of the number 9 into the string value, and then the number 5 was coerced into a string value as well. So that brings us to something that you should know about. Most objects have a toString method. Okay, number values don't, but objects do. And their toString method is what will be called when an object is coerced. So if we have let, I'm not sure if this probably won't work with the integer. Let me say x.toString. Yeah, okay, that does work. You apparently can't do it with string literals. All right, so toString is converting whatever is stored in the variable x to the string version of that. Okay, so if I have an object, let obj equal an object a, oops, a apples, and if I say obj.toString, okay, this is what JavaScript turned this into. This is a string version of the object. Okay, and this isn't particularly helpful. Another way to convert an object into a string is using JavaScript object notation. So JSON.stringify, I can turn my object, obj, into a string value, and I can later write that string value to a file, for example. So notice that this is a string. The whole thing is surrounded by single quotes, making this entire thing a string. And there are double quotes inside of this. Right? So JavaScript object notation, if I were to write this to a file, this entire thing would basically be a JavaScript object represented as characters of string characters. And then I can return this to an object. So if I have saved this in some variable, let s equal JSON.stringify. So now s is my string. If I want to turn that back into an object, I can say let o equal JSON.parse s. And then if I access O, we see we're back to a JavaScript object. Okay? But the point being, because of coercion, nearly every data type has a toString method, and in case JavaScript needs to coerce that value to something other than what it currently is, it will call the toString method to convert it to a string. And that's one of the default coercion techniques. Since everything has a toString method, we just call toString on it, and then we can do whatever operation we may need to do. Okay, so that is, in a nutshell, coercion. There's more to it, but it's important to be aware of. JavaScript will try to coerce certain values. Another example of coercion, let's add a comment here. Coercion would be using double equals. In most programming languages, you have a comparison operator that returns a Boolean value when you compare two values. Boolean values are true or false. So console.log, let's say I have obj.a. We see up here obj.a should equal apple, right? Type there, apple. Okay, so this is the correct type, and we can use double equals and everything works out fine. Run the program. There's our last comparison. Object.a is apple, and that double equal apple, those are the same values, so it returns true. What about if we added something here, x, and we said was 5. Okay, so now let's add a little separator here so we can see. Okay, so now we have object A. Instead of object.a, we want object.x, that's a number, and we want to check to see if that's equal to the string 5. Okay, so up here we set x equal to the number 5, but here we're checking to see if it's equal to the string 5. Now JavaScript is intelligent and does coercion, right? So it's saying, well, you're comparing a number and a string, which doesn't make any sense, so I'll convert them both to strings and then compare them. Okay? So this can be useful or it can be detrimental. Specifically, if I use not equal, okay, this is more common. The value of x is 5, and that does not equal the string version of 5, right? They're different types. They should not equal each other, depending on what you're doing, right? JavaScript is going to check and convert x to an integer and then do the comparison, and this will become false. And that's probably not what you want to happen. Okay, so in order to avoid issues with coercion, well, a feature was added to the language that is triple equals. Okay, so these two lines I'm going to copy and paste, and instead of double equals here, I'm going to add triple equals, and instead of not equal, I'm going to add not double equal. Okay, so these techniques, when you hear the term triple equals, that's comparison in JavaScript that pays attention to types. There's no coercion allowed in this comparison. So if I have a number over here and a string, JavaScript is not allowed to coerce using triple equals. So this is going to be false. So the number 5 does not equal the string 5. So it's important for almost every situation. It's very rare that you would ever want to use double equals. Almost exclusively in JavaScript, we use triple equals and not double equals, right? These two things, even though there's a double equals there, these are commonly referred to as triple equals. So make sure when you're coding and you're using comparisons, that's one difference between Python and JavaScript. Python uses double equals. However, it does pay attention to types. All right, so if you want your triple equals or your comparison operators to behave the same way as in Python, meaning that it makes a distinction between the types of the data, then you want to use triple equals. All right, so we can, if we save that file, we can run this. There we go. And so we see it inverted, right? We had true and then false, and then when we use triple equals, false, because the number 5 does not equal the string 5, and then true, the number 5 does not equal the string 5. This is a true statement, so return true. All right, so that's some basics with arrays. We still have some additional methods on arrays to talk about. So arrays are a collection of values, and what we can do is we create an array literal right here, which means we've literally typed in the structure of an array in our code. But sometimes we might get arrays from different places. We might get arrays from other parts of the program. If we're using HTML, we can do something like get elements by class name, and that returns an array to us. We might not always know how many elements are in the array. That's why we can use array.length to tell us how many items are in the array. But there's additional methods built in that allow us to manipulate the array as well. So let's reset array to a new array, and we're going to call it ARR again, and we're going to start it out empty. And we'll add a little section here. Oops. And what we want to do is let's just print out the array. This is an empty array. And then we want to add items to it. Okay, so we got coercion out of the way. Now we've got array methods. So this is our array. It's empty. We've got array.length. Okay, now if I want to add items to it, I can use array.push. That's similar to Python's append method. So array.push, apples, and now I can log these two items again. Okay, so I'm just logging out the array again, and then array.length. And now we see we do have one item in our list, and the length is 1. Okay, so I can continue to push items like this. And when you push an item, you will see that it gets added to the end of the list. We can't be sure until we do this experiment, because so far we added one item, and that could be added to the beginning or the end or anywhere really. And so we have to add one more item to be sure that we're adding items to the end of the list. And sure enough, we see bananas is added to the end of the list, and our length has increased to 2. So array.push, and again, push is a function, so there are left and right parentheses. So array is our object, it's our variable, and attached to this is the function called push. This is called a method. This method is attached to the object that we are interested in. Okay, so when I say arr.push, this dot means the method is attached to my object. Array is an object. The dot means access the method on this object. And then whatever follows is an identifier that basically tells JavaScript where to locate the function to call. Or there can be other properties on an object as well that don't have to be functions. So the dot operator accesses properties on an object. So an array is an object, we use the dot operator, and we can access the push function. And to call a function or execute a function, we have to use left and right parentheses. And what goes inside of those parentheses is the argument. Okay, the arguments are basically just inputs to the function. The return value is the output. Okay, so you can have multiple inputs to the function. Push just takes one, and here we would say carrots. Push just takes one argument, but in general, functions can have many arguments. All right, so we're going to push carrots, and once again, we're going to see that it has been added to the end of our list. All right, so that's the push method. Then we also have a method called pop, push and pop. So let item equal array.pop. Now pop is a method. However, in JavaScript you cannot place an index value like you can in Python. Pop always removes the last item. Okay, so we can check that by doing a console.log of the item itself. Okay, so array.pop removes the last item from the list and then stores it in this variable. So it returns that value. Alright, so we'll print out that value to make sure that should be carrots, and then we'll log out the other items. So now we log out our array, which should only be apples and bananas because we popped carrots, and then our length should be 2. And sure enough, we have carrots for item, and then an array apples and bananas, and a length of 2. Okay, so that's pop, and it only works with the last item. Now there are other ways to add items to an array. You can add items by simply specifying the index number. I can say array, and I don't have to go in order. I can say array 5 and say something over here that's like grapes. And now if we look at our array and get the length, we see something interesting happened. We set an item at index 5, right? And so JavaScript automatically adds 3 undefined values here. Okay, so there are, even though there were only 2 items in our array, I added an item at index 5. In Python, that would give you an error. Instead, in JavaScript, it goes ahead and adds the item at the right index, and anything that wasn't defined before then just gets an undefined value. But the list still says there are 6 items, okay, which is technically correct. Each one of these, and then 3 values of undefined. Okay, so that is one difference that you need to be aware of in JavaScript. Okay, so you can add items directly using the array number. You can also add items to the beginning of the list. Okay, so to add an item to the beginning of the list, you use unshift. All right, so we can say array.unshift. And we'll say apples in all capitals. And we will log out our array and then the length. And we see we've added an item to the very beginning. The rest of our list remains the same, and our length has increased. Similarly, like push and pop, unshift and shift are opposites. So I can remove an item from the beginning of the list with shift. So item equals, I already defined item, or declared it above with let. So once you've declared a variable, you do not have to declare it again. I'm just reusing it for a different purpose. So I've already declared it, so I'm just using it again. And I can say item equals array dot shift. And this shifts the array over. The reason that's called shift is because all of these items shift to the left, and this item pops off, right? Right. So pop is actually at the end, but this item shifts off. All right. So array.shift item should now be apples with the capital letters, and then console.log, we can log that out. We'll log out item, and we can log out the array, and we can log out the array.length. Okay, so unshift adds something to the front, and then shift removes item from the front of the list, or the start. Okay, so that's how you can add items. You can also, there's a delete keyword that you can also use that removes items from a list. For example, let's say we wanted to remove grapes, right? So we can delete that item from our list. ARR. What do I want to delete from ARR? The item at index. What index did we say that was at? Let's see, we added grapes, and we had length of 6, so that means it's index 5. Length of 6, index 5. Right, so that would be 5, or we could say array.length -1. That's always going to be the last item of our list, right? Because if we have one item in our list, the indexing starts at 0, so the length is 1, -1 is 0, right? If I have 6 items in my list, then 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, so the length of the list is 6 minus 1 gives us the last index because we start the indexing at 0. Okay, so I want to delete the item, the last item in the list. Now notice what happens. I'm going to log the array and the length. So it doesn't remove it from the list, it just deletes the value stored there. So this is interesting behavior. This is different than the delete key in Python, which would remove the element. So we have, actually I'm not sure if it would remove the element in Python. It would remove it in a dictionary. So basically what we have now, there's only 2 string values in our list, but we have 4 empty items. Okay, so delete is not a good way to remove an item from a list if you expect the list length to change. Okay, so if you want to remove an item from a list and you expect the list length to change, right? You do let's see, array.remove, and we can look up some of these array methods. And a good place, common place, you'll see them is in W3 schools. You can take a look at this. We did toString, pushing and popping. Right. We did shift and unshift. Delete. And then splice is an interesting method. It allows you to, the first argument you provide is the number of elements it removes. I'm sorry, the index you start out at. So you start at index 2, so 0, 1, and 2. And then how many items do you want to remove from that index? So 0. And then add these items in there. So right in here before apple, lemon and kiwi are going to be placed. You can try that yourself. So right before apple, lemon, and kiwi get placed there. That's the splice method. We'll go over that too. I do want to find the remove. So it's going to be one of two things. Let's try remove by the actual name. Okay, remove is not a function. So let's see, what's it called in JavaScript? Alright, I've been doing a lot of Python recently. JavaScript remove element from array. So splice is the only way. That's rather upsetting. Alright, so splice is kind of a tricky method because it's uncommon. It's not in any other languages that I'm aware of. So you have array and you can just call splice, and what item do you want to remove? You would specify if you wanted to remove the item grapes, right? We deleted that item. We want to remove the item at index 0, 1, or 2. So we want to go to index 2. And how many items do we want to remove? Well, we've got 4 empty values there, so we can just type 4. Right? And if we don't provide any additional values, nothing else gets added to the array. Okay, and we see these items go. Part of the reason you saw me delay there is because it's not actually very common that this happens in the real world. Obviously should know how to remove an item from a list. However, there are a lot of libraries that help you with that that are more consistent with more standard programming languages. So it's rather odd to have not have a remove method in an array implementation. So you do have one, right? You have splice, but we could make our own that's more conducive to what we're used to, right? So we could define a function remove elements from an array, and I could specify the index that I wanted to remove. So we call this remove element by index. Specify the index, and then what I would do is simply call splice array.splice and pass in the index, and then pass in I want to remove one item. Right, so this is a more common implementation in different programming languages, how to remove an element by an index. Another way I could go about this, which we could test this out real quick, we'll do array.push carrots. So we have some more items in our array. Let's print out our list, and then we're going to remove element by index. Okay. We also have to pass in our array, of course. Okay, so we have an array which we access here, and then we have the index value that we'd like to remove. So index, we pass into the splice method, and we delete one item, and we don't add anything else. Okay, so I can call remove element by index here, array, and remove item at index 0, and I'll print the list again. Okay, so we have apples, bananas, and carrots, and then I remove element by index 0, right? And we pass in the array that I want to remove the item from, and then the index. So this is more standard, something that you might be used to in other programming languages. And there are actually methods, libraries that implement a whole lot of common functionality that JavaScript is kind of missing. It's not completely missing. It's just it's unusually implemented. So a lot of times in the production world, you'll have other libraries that will help you out with some of this stuff. You can, besides removing elements by index, you might want to remove an element by its name. Okay, so let's say you wanted to remove the item apples in here. Let's go ahead and add that back on. So to add that to the beginning of the list, we do array.unshift right? And we add apples back on. We can print that out. Now I might want to remove one of these items. So to do that, I need to find the index. What if I don't know where apples is in my array? What if I have an array of 1,000 items? So what we can do is we can use index of. So I want to find the index of the item apples in this array. So my index is going to be, this will always return a number, and it returns -1 if it cannot find the item in the array. Okay, so console.log index. Let's look at that. I already declared I above, so I don't need to declare it again. Okay, so the index is 0. It did find apples. What if I search for apples with 2 S's? -1, can't find it. What if I search for bananas? It's at index 1. What about carrots? There we go, index of. So basically what this allows me to do is I can take the index and then use splice, arr.splice, and I am starting at index I, that's the index value I found, and I want to remove one item. Right, and then we can log out the array again to see if it worked. And sure enough, we have searched for carrots. We got the index value of 2 up here, and then we spliced the array and removed one item at index 2, which effectively removes carrots from our array. All right, so we could make a function for this too, that is remove element by data, or just remove element. So we can create a function, remove element, and this function is going to take 2 arguments again. We have the array, and then we have the element we would like to remove, so to be removed. And it's important to note that ARR, even though we used the same variable name here in this function, we didn't have to. We could have called this anything. We could have called it A as long as we used A here. So we didn't have to use the same variable name that we did. Right? So just for clarity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and use A here instead of array. So that way, the only reason A is our array is because when we call the function, we pass it in. So when I called remove element by index here, I passed in a specific array, and it just happened to be the one named ARR. Okay, so when JavaScript looks up, tries to call this function, do I have a function called remove element by index? It looks, yes I do. It passed in the data stored in ARR, so now that gets stored in A, and it passed in the data at 0, so that gets stored in index. Okay, so whatever you pass in is the value of A here when you call the function. Similarly here, we're removing an element, and we're going to make use of our index of method and then the splice method as well. So what we want to do is we want to find an index. Now I do have to declare I here because inside of this function, this is a separate scope. It's different than the indentation level up here. When I create a function, I can create a new variable called I that's separate than this variable. Okay, so this variable I only has reference inside of this function. All right, so let I, and I'm going to say this is array.index of, and I want to find to be removed. Okay, now this value I could be -1. So if it's -1, right, and we have to use parentheses around our expression in an if statement in JavaScript. So if I is less than -1, then we just want to go ahead and return from the function. Okay, because, or I'm sorry, if I equals -1. If I equals -1, that means it did not find one of these items in the list, and so there's nothing to remove. So we just return. Otherwise, we're going to return arr.splice, and the index value we found, I, and we're going to remove one item. Okay, so there's two different ways to remove elements now. We have made two separate functions that are a little bit more common to our understanding of most programming languages, but they all, under the hood, use splice. Okay. And so now we can say, let's go ahead and unshift some items or push some items. Arr.push carrots. We can also concatenate arrays. So I have another array, and this might have dates and eggplant and figs. All right. Then I can concatenate these two together. I can say arr.concat arr2, and we can log out the array and the length. Concat returns. Okay, so this does not modify either array. It leaves them both intact. And so it will create a new array, and I could call this arr3, and we'll log out arr3. Okay. Meanwhile, arr still exists and arr2 still exists. Arr would have 3 items in it. Right? Well, we can print that out. So we'll show arr and arr2. There we go. So we see both of these arrays still exist. So the concat method, or concatenate, joins the two arrays and creates a new array, but it leaves the original arrays alone. Okay, so arr.concat joins them together, and arr3. So we have arr3, and we can try to remove an element. So remove element, and we want to remove eggplant. So the first argument is the array, so we have to pass in arr3. And what do we want to remove? That's the second element, and eggplant. And now we can log out and see what's in arr3 now after we removed an item. Remove element. To be removed is eggplant. So let's see if it found an I. Let's console.log in here and see if it found I. I is -1, so it can't find eggplant. To be removed. So console.log is your friend. If something happens and you cannot figure out why it's not working, log out your your variables. Let's see what's happening here. So this is the array, and we are searching for eggplant. Okay, that looks to be right. Oh, here's the problem. ARR. I changed this variable name to A, but I didn't change it here. So it was looking in our old ARR array instead of A, right? And we got to be careful when we do stuff like this, right? I changed the variable name, so I need to change it everywhere within the function, all right? So that's a common mistake that happens, so be cautious of that. Do not carelessly code like I just did, all right? But that's a good learning experience. And again, as I said, use console.log within your functions as you're coding. If you don't know what's being held in a particular variable, or you don't know why something's not working, start using a lot of console.logs. So back to this, we run this, ARR3 has these items, then we call remove element. On ARR3 we are removing eggplant. This time it does work. We removed eggplant and we have 5 elements left in our list. Okay, so that is basically how arrays work in JavaScript. And just remember that they are also objects. So when you use the type of keyword, console.log, if I use type of ARR3, for example, I'm still going to get an object, even though it's an array. So one way to determine if it is an array is if it has the property, has a length property. So you can say, oh, actually, there's a somewhat new method you can do. You can say, I believe it's array.isArray. And that will check to see if the item you have passed in is actually an array. Okay. Whereas if I pass something else in here, like a string or an object, false. Okay. So array.isArray is a newer standard of how you can determine if an object is an array. Don't use type of for that. All right. So that's JavaScript arrays.